Hey all, hope all is well. This is another video in the Road to Grandmaster series, and this one I'm going to go over my round 3 game from the Eastern Open. Now, if you followed the round 2 video, you know that I won a relatively decent game against an untitled player, and that was nice because it got me back on track from a wins perspective because I drew in round 1, and yeah, I had 1.5 out of 2 now and was hoping to build on that momentum. In this one, I was paired up against another untitled player, so a third untitled player in a row, but this time the rating was a little bit higher, so my opponent in this one was just under 2200 FIDE. Definitely someone I should beat, but still a more formidable opponent than the first 2 rounds. And again, a youngster, which is again always tricky because when you play the youngsters, I've said this before, you never quite know what their strength actually is. And I looked at my opponent's games, or my opponent's results rather, before this round, and he'd won down playing down in round 1, but actually had drawn a Grandmaster in round 2. So I knew it was not someone I should take lightly. Now, I've been talking about him kind of vaguely. His name is Draganoff, and he's 19 years old, and I believe he goes to the University of Pennsylvania because he actually was sporting a UPenn sweatshirt. So, college-age student that, obviously was a pretty decent chess player in high school and, probably just took a weekend off to play some chess because this tournament was held in Princeton, New Jersey, so it's not too far from the Pennsylvania area. But anyways, without further ado, let me jump into it. So Daniel was white and I was black, and again, I really did not know what he was going to play, but I thought the Caro had treated me well in round 1, at least from an opening perspective. Obviously, the game after that did not go so well. But I thought that I should, be able to try it out again. So after e4, I went c6, and then here on move 2, Daniel played c4, and I actually thought for like 30 seconds. I knew what my move was going to be after c4, because c4 invites the pan-off attack of the Caro Khan, but I just wanted to kind of slow down a little bit just because normally the lines after c4 are quite forcing, and I wanted to kind of like pace myself, jog my memory, if you will, to get ready for a potential theory battle. Because after c4, if you're a Caro Khan player, you're going to go d5 anyway. Some players, they might go g6 and head towards some type of fianchetto towards some type of fianchetto that looks like a King's Indian, but I'm a Caro guy, so I was like, okay, I'm going to take this challenge. And after ed5 and cd5, typically here white players play d4, knight c3, knight f3, and they're comfortable playing with the isolated pawn potentially that can happen on d4, but because in return they get a lot of attacking chances against the king. But one of the kind of annoying lines in this variation of the pan-off that some white players play is the move c takes d5. And the idea in this variation actually is to try and hold on to the pawn. So the point is that you don't actually play queen takes d5 because this is actually not a great move. After knight c3, you're kind of forced to go back, and white gains an important tempo on the queen and actually gets a nice lead in development. So you don't go queen takes d5, and you try to recover that pawn with knight f6. That's what I actually did. But then here is essentially white's point. White actually in this position went for the move queen a4 check. And while this move is not the most dangerous or move in the Caro Khan, and there are definitely lines that are a little bit more challenging, it is a tricky one. And the reason for it is white is actually trying to hold on to the pawn. So the first point is that if white plays a move black plays moves like bishop d7, white will just go queen b3, and you could see here that the pawn is nicely defended on d5, and also b7 is also a target, so that's not so pleasant. So typically here, black players play knight bd7, and that's what I played, and you can see the d5 pawn is still attacked. But now, white played the move knight c3, and now you can sort of see the contours of the position starting to take shape, because what you have is a situation where I'm not going to win the d5 pawn in the next few moves. And the reason I'm not is because, first of all, it's well protected right now, and my knight on d7 cannot move for the very foreseeable future because of the pin against the king on e8. So because of that, the point is that black is going to try and play around the pawn and continue developing and kind of hope that he gets the pawn later under favorable circumstances where his development and activity overwhelms white. In some circumstances, though, black doesn't get the pawn back at all, and black's hoping that these double D pawns aren't really so much of an asset and they're difficult to mobilize, whereas the queen on a4 isn't so great there beyond this pin. So the point is that later, if after black castles, this queen might be a little bit misplaced. So after knight c3, I played the move g6, beginning the process of untangling, fianchéing my bishop and castling. Note that e6 is just out of the question because then white would happily take on e6, get rid of a double pawn and also incur an isolated e-pawn in my position. So not really something I want to do. So after g6, white played bishop c4, and this is the other idea, is that white's kind of just going to pile up the pieces in front of that d-pawn, or behind that d-pawn rather. And the point is that even after I castle, I'm not going to have enough attackers on it. And so it's kind of a weird way to play, just from a optical perspective. It seems like the pieces here are a little bit clumsy. The bishop on this diagonal doesn't look so great, but it's just trying to hold on to that pawn. So that's what Daniel was trying to do. So anyways, I played bishop g7. White played d3, just protecting this bishop on c4. I castled, and white played knight f3. And here's actually the first moment where I can actually think about what I should do, because my knight on d7 is freed, so I can technically already harass the queen on a4 and open up the queen and my own knight from b6 to attack the d5 pawn, but it might not actually still be enough, because if I wind up getting 1, 2, and 3 attackers on the d5 pawn, if the queen just drops to b3, white would actually have 3 defenders. So even in that scenario, I'm not quite winning the pawn, and that's kind of annoying. The other thing is that I could try to get the 2 bishops and argue that that's compensation for the pawn, but if I take on c4, if he takes back with the d-pawn, then he has a really nice pawn chain that's kind of healthy, and the d-pawn is no longer doubled, and a rook can eventually come to d1 and further reinforce the d-pawn, and so those positions might be pleasant for white. And so the question is how to kind of continue here with the activity, since you're not going to win the pawn back right away. And I thought the move that did that was a6. And the idea with a6 is that I'm kind of threatening the move b5, forking the bishop and the queen. Because if you go for castles, actually after b5, you might say, well, doesn't this move bishop takes b5 just ensure that white wins another pawn and I can't take on b5 because the a8 rook is hanging? Well, for the moment it looks like it does, but actually there's the tactical defensive move knight b6, which both holds the rook on a8 and attacks the queen on a4, which allows black to recover the bishop on b5 on the next move. In this type of position, black would just be a piece up. So essentially a6 does threaten b5, and white has to do something about it. White played the move queen a3, ultimately just sidestepping the b5 move now, because now if I play b5, after bishop takes b5, there's no knight b6 idea. The bishop can just move back, and this is a kind of a victory for white, just getting that pawn. So this would not be as ideal. So after queen a3, I actually played the move knight b6, and it's kind of an interesting point because I could have played knight b6 a move previously without a6. I could have played knight b6 here, and now I thought the move would be queen b3. And so because now with queen b3 is kind of reinforcing the c4 pawn that's going to come to that square, and in turn the d5 pawn. And so I thought it was a kind of clever finesse to start with a6, because now queen b3 would not be possible right away because b5 actually traps the bishop. There are no entry squares right now, and there's no pin on the rook anymore. And so I actually I thought gained a little bit of a tempo with a6 first, and after queen a3, knight b6 now, because now white actually played queen b3. And the point here is that in some circumstances, he is still defending the c4 pawn, but he's also given me an extra tempo. Note that the reason queen b3 needed to be played is because I was not actually just eyeing the bishop, I was eyeing the d5 pawn, and that needed an extra defender. So after queen b3, I'm still not winning this pawn, and the question is what to do from here. And I thought about it for a while, but I thought I need to play with some more energy, and so I opted for the move bishop g4. And my idea here was that if allowed, I'd be happy to play bishop takes f3 and give white double pawns on the king side, which I thought would mean his king would be a little bit more airy, and I thought that would kind of give me a good position, because I figured that the structure would be really, really ugly to play with. I thought black would have a fine position here. Maybe knight h5 at some point. Maybe playing through the middle with rook c8. I just did not believe this was a structure that would be desirable for white. So after bishop g4, I felt, you know what, this might be an interesting plan. Another plan in the position that is actually quite playable that the computer actually advocates is knight takes c4. And the point is that after d takes c4, black actually goes b5 and gives up a pawn to actually rip open this pawn chain. And now black's lead in development is actually a factor, because castling is the best move. If you play c takes b5, after a takes b5, black's actually threatening b4, which would undermine the defense of this d5 pawn indirectly, because the knight would have to move or the queen would have to capture. And if the knight actually gets to d5 and secures the d pawn, the two bishops would be ample compensation in the position. So yeah, so basically, let's say queen takes b5. That doesn't work actually, because bishop a6 and white doesn't castle. Let's say after castles, now b4. A position like this, like queen takes b4, knight takes d5, takes. Even though, you know, it appears that white just has these queenside pawns that are connected and passed, black has, I think, enough counterplay here based on the two bishops and the open files for the rooks. It's unclear and probably unlikely that black could expect more than a draw here, but black isn't really worse, and would, I think, wind up holding this quite easily. Instead, I didn't opt for that and went for the move bishop g4. And here, this kind of forces the knight into action, so white played the move knight e5 because he didn't want to give himself those double pawns. And now I have to make a decision. Should I allow this e5 knight to capture the bishop, or should I do something else? I decided that I should continue to play with energy, and I felt that if I played a move like bishop f5, white could just castle, and I wasn't sure what I had achieved with my bishop g4 maneuver. And so my idea was actually to play the move queen c7, and this is actually what I wound up playing. Or excuse me, not queen c7. I played knight takes c4 first, but it was in conjunction with queen c7. This was the idea: play knight takes c4, and then after d takes c4, which was played, to now play queen c7. And the point was, I thought it might be a little bit unattractive to actually take on g4, because now white still couldn't castle because I'd have queen takes h2 mate. And the combination of the queen lining up against this knight and my queen also eyeing the c4 pawn, I thought gave me ample counterplay. I was constantly eyeing this b5 break. I was not something that was foreign to me that I should maybe consider playing b5 to break up this pawn chain while I can. I just didn't want to rush it, and I thought that maybe I had better moves that allowed me to play it under better circumstances. And so that's why I kind of held off on it. After queen c7, though, Daniel played the move bishop f4. And yeah, this is actually quite an interesting move now, because now my queen on c7 is under fire and knight takes g6 is a threat. And I have to, keep the initiative going, because again, if white castles kind of unscathed, I did not believe that I believe that advantage would completely pass over to white. And so it was really incumbent upon me to try and play with energy here. Another option instead of bishop f4 was the move f4, protecting the knight on e5 like that. But I really didn't strongly consider this an option, because I thought that this would really weaken the a7 to g1 diagonal too much, and also the second rank. Whenever you push the f-pawn, you weaken a diagonal and the whole rank. And amazingly here, the move b5 is very strong. The point is that you're just ripping open files and to just get counterplay against the white king. And after a move like c takes b5 and a takes b5, black has a lot of compensation and activity here for the pawn deficit. And this is actually a really, really dodgy position for white to play. Instead, white should probably play bishop b3, kind of covering this diagonal a little bit. But now I could actually just take on c4, and after queen takes c4, even trade queens. And black here has enough play to get to, hold the game. Essentially, white is still a pawn up in the position, but the two bishops and the counterplay against the long diagonal, the counterplay on the C and B files should be enough for black to kind of stabilize, although it still would require precise play here, and it is still a messy position. Instead, after bishop f4, I had to kind of deal with this threat of knight g6, so I decided to play the move knight h5. And the idea here is that now the bishop is under fire, so knight g6 would just be a bad move because I can pick up a piece. Note that knight takes f8 is not a great move either, because now, even knight takes g2 is a very good move, but after rook takes f8 as well, black just has two pieces for the rook and a winning position. So instead, white is kind of forced to play knight takes g4, because you can't even drop the bishop back on g3, because I'll take it there as well. And also, I've actually uncovered my bishop on the e5 knight, so there are two attackers on it now. So after knight takes g4, I now play the move knight takes f4, and this was essentially my idea, is that I managed to get the bishop, both of white's bishops off the board. I'm still a pawn down, but I thought the knight on f4 was a really, really active piece. And in many positions, I thought it could even be an attacking piece, because I remember Kasparov once said that a knight on f5 with white is like almost worth a rook. Like, it's just, when there's a knight on f5, there's going to be an attack. And sometimes it's the same for black. When you have a knight on f4, there might be some type of initiative, because if the king is castled kingside, the most sensitive pawn in the position, the g-pawn, is actually very weak and only defended by the king. And so that was kind of what I was angling for. But in this position, after knight takes f4, white just castled, and I spent some time looking at the position here, and I couldn't really figure out a way to, get at this white king, because there was only this knight on f4 in the neighborhood. And so it didn't really seem to me like I could get any more pressure. Note, my queen can't really nudge itself closer. And I am still a pawn down, so I thought, yeah, this maybe is not... maybe this won't actually result in attack. I'd still have to just play for compensation. And so after Daniel castled, I played the move rook a c8. But this is actually a slight mistake, and actually kind of a big mistake, because it kind of I did not come to terms with the new position before me, which was that I don't really have an attack or an initiative, and I should kind of be playing to equalize instead of playing keeping tension in the air and one move threats, because now white's king is safe and the threats are going to be going away if white consolidates. And so rook a c8 attacks this pawn on c4, but it can be defended quite easily, and it kind of misses the mark as far as putting pressure on the position it goes. Instead, the best move in the position was, again, the thematic b5. And the point is, ripping open this pawn chain really does wonders for my activity and play in the position. White, of course, would take, and after a takes b5, if knight takes b5, I can actually go queen d7 and attack the g4 knight. And after knight e3, I can play knight e2 check. And this check is actually really important because I can pop back into d4 with tempo at times. And so after king h1 and rook a b8, these pieces are pinned, and I'm threatening knight d4. And after a4, knight d4, we get a liquidation that is actually favorable for black. And even with limited material here, with basically a 4 versus 5, which is going to turn into a 4 versus 4 in a moment because the b pawn might drop. Black might have a little bit of play in the position just because the bishop might be a little bit better than the knight. But the most likely result is probably a draw, and I think that's partially why I was kind of discouraged by playing b5 all the time, is because the game just fizzled out, and I didn't really want that to happen. And so, yeah, I kind of shied away from playing the best move because I wanted to keep life in the position, but this, basically takes on some risk. So after rook a c8, white played knight e3, and if I want to keep the game going, I really have to, kind of come up with some magic here, and I really wasn't able to do that. So I played bishop takes c3, and I thought that this was the magic that, I needed because I'm ruining the pawn structure and forcing the pawn to recapture instead of the queen because I have knight e2 check. But this is not. This again comes with some risks because I'm giving up my dark square bishop, the pride and joy of my fianchetto, and also my king side for a knight. And you have to really ask yourself with that cost benefit analysis if it's worth it. Now it is a reasonable move, but the follow up has to be good. And after this exchange, again, the best move in the position, you could probably guess it now, is the move b5. Opening up some files, trading some pawns, but I just did not see a scenario where I could win a position like this. I'm still a pawn down. I may very well get one of my pawns back, but then we're just going to find ourselves in a rook endgame, which is probably a 4 and 4 on the same side, and really no chances of actually winning the game. And again, black has a lot of activity here. This knight is very menacing, controlling some of the entry points for the white rook. So it is annoying, but I didn't really buy it, and so I didn't go for it. Instead of b5, I played the move rook fd8, trying to keep some tension in the position and play for an e6 break. But this move is actually not very good because I'm not really getting counterplay on the d file, and this gives white some time to consolidate. And so white started with the move a4, which is actually a very, very effective move because now he's clamping on the b5 break pretty much permanently because now white could take with the a pawn and then the queen. And he's also fixing the b pawn as a backward pawn because if I don't liberate with b5, then my b pawn's going to be a target, and I've really failed to appreciate to just basically appreciate that was going to be a problem. I played the move rook d7 now, kind of preempting an attack against the b7 pawn, but better would have been to play knight d3 and swing this knight over to c5, where the b pawn is not only protected by the knight, but the knight's also kind of blockading all of white's pawn mass on the queen side in the center. So that would have just been a way more precise move because now, after rook d7, I really wanted to play knight d3 next, but white played queen c2 and took away that option from me. And so in just the span of like 4 or 5 moves, I tried to keep some life in the position, some tension in the position, but now I'm just a clear pawn down, and I haven't really gotten the proper compensation for it. And so my position is worse. I now played the move knight h5, which was really a difficult pill to swallow, but I just did not see any future on the f4 square, and I thought that white might play g3 or queen e4, and just the prospect of it being attacked was kind of unnerving to me, so I thought it now might be better to kind of stabilize it on a different square. So after knight h5, white went queen e4, which is a good move, just centralizing the queen. Rook a b1 right away was also an option, just putting pressure on the b pawn. But after queen e4, I went now knight f6 and challenged the queen on e4. I actually considered for a moment the move f5, and I thought that might actually be a good idea to try and take some space on the king side and maybe make the position a little bit unclear. But I was wary of the move queen e6 check. And I was a little bit concerned that maybe these weak squares e5 and e6 were not really worth it. It turns out I can play king f8, and after f4, I actually have the move knight takes f4. So it's actually not such a huge problem, but the king on f8 seems kind of airy, and it's kind of a risky play. The point is, though, that the move knight g7 is actually threatening to trap the queen. So if white does nothing, let's say like h3, remarkably the knight on g7 is actually trapping the queen, and there are just no squares. So yeah, it was a possibility, but I didn't really strongly consider it. So instead I went knight f6, and then white went queen d4. This is actually a really nice square for the queen because it's actually 2 diagonals away from the knight, so it can't be harassed for the next few moves. It's really protecting all of the relevant queenside pawns, and in some positions it's actually keeping an eye on black's kingside pawns, and this last detail is one that I failed to appreciate. I now played the move knight e8, kind of searching for that counterplay still, and my hope was that I could try and get in knight d6 and challenge the c4 pawn, but I did kind of think that this knight e8 move was probably a little bit suspicious, because typically when you move forces back in a position with a ton of pieces on the board, it's usually not very good, and especially because the position is open, there is the chance that white can kind of do something really active in the center. And white tried to play the move knight g4 and take advantage of my backwards knight move, and already I'm kind of in a tough spot because knight h6 actually is a mate threat, because after knight h6 I can't go to h8, I might have to go to f8, and then queen h8 is just mate, and I kind of have to block that diagonal. And so in this position I was like, what should I do? What should I do? And I thought, you know what, maybe I can play f6. Maybe I can block the queen on the diagonal and still continue with my knight d6 plan. But again, just like when I was looking at the f5 move a few moves ago, I was just kind of discouraged by the idea of f6 and then queen e3 taking advantage of now the e pawn being backward. And I thought having 2 backward pawns, both the e pawn and the b pawn, was kind of risky. But amazingly, it turns out that black is actually totally fine here, and in part because moving the queen away from e3 weakens these pawns, and I can't take on c4 right away because there's queen e6 check picking up the rook on d7, but I can kind of consolidate my king side and then entertain threats against these pawns. And so I can play the move king h8, strangely enough, moving the king into the corner voluntarily, but then after queen e6, playing the move knight g7. And remarkably, this kind of holds my position together, because if the queen continues to try to encroach, it's really just a one-man band. And after the move queen d8, I'm actually holding up any initiative on this side of the board, and I'm also threatening rook takes c4. And in some positions now, I actually don't mind trading queens, because these c-pawns are now targets. So instead, I just could not bring myself to do that. I mean, f6 was just a little bit more than I was willing to chew. And so I played the move knight f6 instead. And this in some ways was kind of my way of a tacit draw offer, because I kind of recognized that white could take on f6. And after knight takes f6, t takes f6, and queen takes f6, White is really temporarily 2 pawns up, but I thought that after queen takes c4, I was probably going to get one of them back and be able to make a draw. But Daniel actually correctly judged that, there's no reason to go for a line like this because white is so much more active. And so after knight f6, Daniel very quickly played the move knight e5, and it's just a very good move. Hitting my rook with tempo, pretty much calling into question why I was on d7 in the first place, and just getting more time to consolidate his pawn advantage. So I now played the move rook d8, trying to kind of get my rooks connected and back up, but actually a much better move would have been the move rook d6. And part of the reason for that is now my rook sometimes is actually covering the b6 square, so I can actually try to blockade with b6 if need be. Whereas with my rook on d8, when rook fb1 comes on the board, I actually can't play b6. So rook d8 was actually kind of a huge miss. I should have tried to defend the b6 square again. After rook d8, white now played the move rook ab1. You could see b6 is not possible here because it just hangs a pawn. And that was actually kind of frustrating because I realized here that I kind of messed that up. After rook b1, I now played the move h5. And this move is not very good, but I was hoping under the right circumstances that if the queen left the d4 square, I could actually go knight g4 and actually get rid of these knights. Because it was quite clear to me that the knight on e5 was better than my knight on f6 for now. And so I really wanted to get rid of it and get closer to this kind of rook endgame type of position that I thought would be give me better chances to hold. And quite frankly, this was already kind of trending toward my game in the first round, where in the first round I played an untitled player in the Caro-Kann, had a ton of problems, and then I managed to hold it and probably a losing rook endgame a pawn down. I was kind of thinking that was going to be my way to hold, getting to a rook endgame a pawn down and trying to hold. So a tough circumstance, tough reality to kind of live under, but I was trying to adjust to that reality. But the real issue with h5 is it just weakens the king side quite a bit, in particular the g6 pawn. And so it's actually quite risky to do this because sometimes sacrifices can work on that square, and sometimes the queen can just infiltrate on the squares that were left behind. And so h5 is a risky move. After h5, white played the move rook fe1, and this is actually just an excellent move, getting the rook to the half-open e-file. Really now all of white's pieces are super active. You can see that I'm playing on the last 3 ranks, and that's never really a great sign if it's something that's going to be happening for an extended period of time. After rook e1, I now played the move rook d6, and this was a very, very painful move to play because I had the option of going rook d6 a few moves ago after the knight on e5 challenged it, and I thought now this was kind of my only chance was to play rook d6 and then defend the pawn with b6 and kind of hold up white's counterplay on the b file. But I had completely, and I mean completely, missed white's next move. And after this move, I'm completely losing. So why don't you pause the video here and try to figure out white to play and win, how white can kind of play this one. All right, so the move here that wins on the spot and the move that Daniel actually played is the move Queen a7. And he played this move, and I was in total shock because essentially I totally missed the fact that I'm pretty much losing the b pawn. Now, there are actually even easier ways to win, so I'll actually show you the other 2 ways that are actually quite good as well. One of them is queen f4, just shifting the queen over to the king side, and sometimes tactically lining the queen up against c7. This move would be really strong because the knight on f6 is paralyzed because f7 is hanging, and basically black is really tied up, and it's going to be a slow death, but it's not immediate, but black is lost here. Another move that actually wins is actually the move f4, just reinforcing the knight on e5. Now knight g4 is never really a threat because white would be happy to recapture with the f-pawn, and black's just getting run over. And you can see here there are no real pawn breaks that are effective, because if I ever try to play e6, the knight on f6 is loose, so there are tactical tricks connected to queen takes f6. But I thought queen a7 was just stunning, and I really did not see this move. I just missed the fact that the queen could come from behind and attack b7. And it's just a devastating, honestly. I was pretty much so shell-shocked that I played the move b5 extremely quickly, and I thought, all right, I'm much worse, just losing, and in circumstances like that, I need to play quicker, because that's really the only way I can win or even draws. Play quickly and hope that they mess up with less time. But a better move instead of b5 would have been the move b6, just giving up the a6 pawn and then actually going e6. And at least in this position, the queen no longer being on d4 means that there aren't tactical threats against my knight on f6 with these discoveries. So at least here I can fight on for some time. After knight c6, I could play king g7, a5, and you have some variations where essentially black is fighting, but white is going to win the game. Instead, I played the move b5, and basically my idea was, I recognized this position was pretty much lost and that the b pawn was lost, and so I thought that I was going to try and make a mess of it and make it difficult to convert that way. So at least after b5, I thought the queens come off the board, because I'm also threatening b takes c4. So after queen takes c7, rook takes c7, a takes b5, and a takes b5, white played the move rook takes b5, and this move I actually expected, and I saw here that I'm 2 pawns down, but if you look at the position, they're 2 doubled c pawns, and so what I thought is that, well, doubled pawns are obviously not the best pawns, and so I thought the doubled c pawns are really not 2 pawns. It's really maybe like 1.5, and because of that, I thought there might be some chances to hold the game based upon that feature in the position. And I can basically just fight. Now, it turns out that the move c takes b5 would have actually been way stronger, but I think it would be difficult for someone to actually play this, because you're pretty much willingly giving up one of your pawns, and just being up and remaining a pawn up, although the difference here is that you actually have no double pawns, and this actually kind of helps, because after knight takes d5, which was very important to stop the move b6, white can now play the move c4, and having 2 connected is actually very, very nice. So it actually feels like, even though I'm a pawn down, it seems worse because there are 2 connected that are unopposed by any black pawns. And so here, this would be a much easier conversion. And after knight b6, white has the move knight c6. And this really hurts the black cause, because now e7 is hanging. And so white is actually happy to exchange c for e if it means that the rook gets active and the b pawn is still on the board. And after knight takes e4, rook c1 is actually winning, because I have to give up an exchange. If the knight moves away, I don't even know where, but let's say the knight moves back to b6, there's knight takes e7 check, and the rook is lost. And if I go knight b6, if I go rook takes e6, I'm an exchange down, and there's just a 3-on-3 on the same side, which should just be winning. There's no chance of a blockade here, especially when the rooks are going to come off the board pretty quickly because of this pin. So, so remarkably, being 1 pawn up with connected passers is better than being 2 pawns up with double pawns. So always think about quality and not just quantity in whatever position you're looking at. So anyways, after rook takes b5, I'd kind of seen, okay, maybe these double pawns might not be so great. And so I played the move e6, trying to get rid of my backward e pawn and exchange e for d and get to that scenario that I was looking at. Now, this is probably the one last chance for white to have like a really kind of favorable winning structure. And it's not so easy to see because the natural move in this position is d takes c6, and this is the move that Daniel played because this pawn is attacked 3 times now, and it's not easy to defend. And if you play a move like rook d1 trying to defend, I could still take and then just take the one on c3. And so it makes sense to take on e6. But it actually turns out that the best move in the position is actually f3. And the reason for this is not only do you take the squares away from my knight on g4 and e4, you also give your king a back rank, a square off of the back rank, and you help it move towards the center. And then the biggest point is that after e takes d5, which would seem to be a dream for black, now only 1 pawn down, and still these double pawns seem kind of weak. The issue here is that white has the very nice move c5. And all of a sudden, the c-pawn is actually more of a factor because the knight can't be harassed. And after rook e6, knight d3 is actually a really nice technical move. Because if you trade these rooks, the knight will come back to d3. This king will walk to d4. And black won't really have much counterplay because the knight can't move forward in the position, and the king running to the d4 square happens very, very quickly. And so, yeah, amazingly, this position is actually easier to win than some of the other positions that happen later in the game. Instead, after d takes e6, rook takes e6, I still kind of have some life here because now rook takes c4 is a threat based upon the fact that there is a back rank problem and the rook on e1 is unprotected. So now white played the move king f1, protecting that rook. And now I played the move king g7, getting my king off of the back rank and also starting to try and loosen the screws a little bit. I might have plans now of swinging my rook over to the a file and getting some pressure and counterplay like that. In some positions, I might consider knight g4, getting the knights off the board, because if I'm able to recover one of the c pawns and just be a rook down, just be a 1 pawn down, some of those endings are drawn if my rook gets behind the pawn. So I was just trying to entertain scenarios here where I can try and hold the game. And I'm 2 pawns down here, but they're not the best quality pawns. After king g7, white played f4. This is a reasonable move, protecting the knight on e5 and freeing the rook up to do something else. You could have also played the move c5 again, and this is a move that the computer kind of advocates. And again, the point a lot of times is that after is that rook b6 is actually a move, trying to trade the rooks like that. And if rook a6, g3, knight g4, and some scenarios like this actually are quite playable for white because now this rook is actually gets to wedge itself in between the c pawns. And again, rooks like to be behind pawns to push them. And actually, this c4 square is a nice square to be on to do that. Instead, f4 is played though, and I now went rook a6, seeking counterplay somewhere else because now the e file is kind of shut down. White now played the move rook b1, which is a really good move. The threat here is actually rook b7, and the problem for me here is that my f7 pawn is also dropping. So if I try to get active with a move like rook a3, after rook b7, the rooks are forced off the board, and rook takes f7 is a serious threat, so the position would just be lost. So instead, I kind of have to cover the b7 square, and so I played the very passive-looking move, rook a7, but it's really the only move to stay in the game. After rook a7, white played king e2, and so Daniel's done a really good job so far as the converting is concerned. I mean, he didn't find the most precise continuation, but he's managed to consolidate pretty decently. The rooks are now active on the b file, and now the king is coming in. So far, so good. I now played the move knight e4. I'm trying to get some counterplay again because my rooks are both stuck defending b7, and so I need to try and hop around and create some type of mayhem around the c-pawns, and at least now I'm attacking c3. After knight e4, white played king d3, and now I played knight c5 check, challenging the king. And after king d4, I went knight e6 check, challenging the king again. And, of course, if the king went back, I would be more than happy with a repetition. And so white played king e3, just not allowing that. And here I played the move knight c5, trying to defend the b7 square like that, and freeing my rook to actually maneuver again and maybe get some counterplay on some of white's queenside and kingside pawns. Now, it actually turns out that the best move in the position is actually a move that I'd considered but ultimately rejected because I thought it didn't work tactically, and that's the move f6. Now, I thought f6 was an interesting move because it, if the knight moves, then the c4 pawn is hanging, but I rejected it because of the tactic knight takes g6. And I thought that this was really problematic for me because if I play king takes g6, there's actually f5 check, and white essentially traded material here and got the knights off the board, and then my kingside pawn structure is shattered. So after king f7, a scenario like this I thought would probably be losing for black because now h5 is weak and can be taken, and the king is actually too open here to be secure. So I thought, you know what, that's knight takes g6, no way am I going for this. But actually, after knight takes g6, I missed that I can just play rook takes c4 anyway and leave the knight on g6. And here it's a little bit different because now the c3 pawn is hanging as well. And so if you play knight h4, I can also take on c3. And all of a sudden, it's just a 3 versus 2, and the king is actually kind of exposed on e3. And black might actually hold this one. So after king d2, I would have to double my rooks. And here, I do have some checks, and my king is still not getting mated, and the f4 pawn is hanging. So there's actually more life in this position for black than it looks, and I probably should have gone for f6. Of course, white can also go knight d3 and not take on g6, but after rook takes e4 and this type of position, again, I'm just a pawn down now, and even though it's still better for white, it's not over. Not over at all. So instead I played knight c5, and now white played rook b6, and this is actually a pretty good move because now white's actually threatening to play rook c6, trading a pair of rooks. And I thought that once the pair of rooks come off the board, it's going to be really, really difficult to do anything because then I only have one rook left, and that rook will probably have to babysit the c-pawn from advancing. So that really was my concern now, and it seemed like I couldn't avoid the trade of rooks because rook c6 also attacked my knight. So I thought I was pretty much going to lose in the next 10 or so moves. After rook b6, I played the move f6 now, trying to challenge the knight, and white went knight c6, moving the knight and attacking the rook. And this is actually another good move because now I have a problem where I can't hold the b7 square together because my rook is on a7 is forced to leave the 7th rank. And so I went to rook a2, which was the most active square I could find, at least attacking these kingside pawns. But now white played the winning move, rook 1 b5. And essentially here, the knight on c5 is just being forced off that square, and this allows white to then play rook b7 next. So, yeah, the rooks are coming off. I went knight e6, and now rook b7 was played, and I pretty much have to, take the rook, I thought, because if I do anything else, then my knight is actually going to be pinned. So I took the rook, and after rook takes, I had to play the very sorry move king f8. And this was another thing that was extremely discouraging because my initial plan was to go king h6. But here, knight e7 actually threatens knight g8 checkmate. And that would be a funny mate, right? Like rook g2, knight g8 mate. And yeah, my king is actually really, really weak there. And if I go for a move like g5, now there's actually f5, which with the same problems pretty much, because knight g8 is again another kind of annoying mating idea. I could play knight g7 to kind of block the checkmate. At least my king would have the h7 square. But here, knight g8's check is still effective because after king h7, there's knight takes f6. And this position is just completely lost. So I have to go to f8. And this actually makes the position very, very lost because with my king being cut off on the 7th rank, now as the c-pawn advances, I can't really, hope to challenge it. And yeah, I'm basically just playing with a hand tied behind my back. And so being 2 pawns down and with a passive position, I really did think the game was going to be over in a few moves, and I was prepared to resign. Like mentally, I told myself this was probably it, and be prepared for the game to end quickly, just so I'm not disappointed when it actually happens. White now played the move knight d4, which is actually a really, really good move, challenging this knight on e6 and also, trying to undouble the pawns because 2 connected passers that aren't doubled are going to be winning. I now played the move knight d8, which is, again, just a sad reality of the circumstances. And, I couldn't trade the knight, so I thought, well, I have to keep him on the board, and at least I'm attacking the rook. And here, white played the move rook b6, attacking my f6 pawn. But this was actually kind of a surprising move to me because I thought the move that was way more natural was the move rook b8. And I think 9 times out of 10, most players would play this move, so I was kind of didn't understand why my opponent didn't. I can't speak to what he saw or didn't see, but in this move, you just pin the knight, you force me to go king e7, and then you can just go c5 and actually start marching your pawn. And the point is that if I try to take the g-pawn, c6 is really, really strong because my king can't come closer with king d6 because the d8 knight hangs, and c7 will actually attack the knight and threaten queen. So once the pawn gets to c7, it will promote. And giving my knight up here hardly prolongs the game. I mean, essentially, white still has a very, very healthy pawn here and a very decent pawn here, which will prevent me from getting really quick runners. So this position is just completely lost. Instead, though, rook b6 gave me some chance, and I was just really puzzled by that because now at least I can play rook takes g2 and not worry about the c-pawn just yet. And here I was completely expecting rook takes f6, but a very, very stunning move happened here, and I really can't explain it. I don't know if he had just missed that the pawn was hanging or he had calculated a long line that he thought was winning. I think it was kind of the latter because he played the move knight e6 check, and this move actually trades the knights, but it does not win a pawn. And I was like, what in the world is he doing? He's actually allowing me to win 2 pawns and get to a rook endgame that's even material? That wasn't necessary. It turns out that after rook f6, king g6, king g7, and rook d6, white is still very much in the driver's seat. My knight has to move, and then the rook can go to b6, and then, the c-pawn can begin to run. And again, the c-pawn is going to have to be offered up for, or the knight on f7 is going to have to offer itself up for the c-pawn because this rook isn't really going to get back in time. But after knight e6 check, the circumstance changed, and all of a sudden, after knight takes e6, rook takes e6, and the very important king f7, the position is no longer winning for white because all of a sudden I'm going to recover the h2 pawn, and the material is actually equal. Now, I will say this. During the game, I actually thought white was still better. I thought that I was still trying to hold a draw, and I thought that white actually had really good winning chances, because after the move rook e4, I was very fearful that my king was actually forever cut off and could not support stopping the c-pawn from queening. And if that's the case, I thought that this king would actually run towards the center really quickly, and then the c-pawn would just run up the board, and my king just could not go any further. And so after rook takes h2 and white played c5, I actually was in the tank for probably like 15 to 20 minutes trying to figure out pretty much what I thought were only moves to actually hold the game. Now, it turns out that there weren't only moves here, and black was actually completely fine, but I really did not I didn't see this during the game. During the game, I really thought I was actually nearly losing, even in this scenario. And after my long think, I played the move rook a2, which is a good move, but it's not like I'm losing this by a tempo, or I'm saving this game by a tempo. It's really not even close for white. And my idea with rook a2 was that I'm actually just trying to get my rook back in time and stop the c-pawn from getting too far up the board. After rook a2, white played the move king d4, and this is a move that was kind of surprised me. I was actually kind of worried about the move c6, and this is actually what I was worried about. I thought that this position is actually still very close to winning for white, and that black has to be very careful, because if I go rook a8, I thought that white would actually just march in with the king, and a scenario like this I thought might just be losing, because this king is really quick, and the c-pawn might queen. But what I had missed, though, was that if you play c6, I can actually play the move rook a8, and this actually is a huge difference, just not trying to blockade on the on c7, but just trying to blockade on c8, and then after king d4, actually pushing my own pawn. Or excuse me, not after c6, going rook a6. This was the key thing, not going rook a8, going rook a6. And the point here is that if c7, I actually can get behind the pawn, and so you kind of need to go rook c4. And now I can go rook a8, and this is a huge difference, because now the king is actually not getting as quickly to challenge my rook as it wants to. And after king d4, now I can go h4, and all of a sudden my h-pawn is as much an asset as the c-pawn, and the presence of the rook here means that it can't get back quickly enough to contest the h-pawn. And so this position is actually just better for black and requires real precision for white to hold. So this was the thing that actually surprised me about the line, is I did not need to go all the way back with rook a8. I can actually go rook a6 and force the move rook c4. Anyways, instead king d4 came on the board, and here I actually was like, uh-oh, I'm still playing only moves, but it's actually just not the case. And I played the move rook a4 check and thought this was extremely clever, because I thought it forced the move c4, preventing the rook from getting behind the pawn. But actually, the best move here again is now rook a8. And the point is that if c6 now, I can actually play rook e8. And amazingly, this endgame is actually just winning for black, because I actually forced the rooks off the board. And if I force the rooks off the board, my king can actually blockade the double c-pawns, and I'm the one that has a 3 versus 1 on the king side. And so c7 is actually forced, because if you actually go rook e8, after king takes, king c5, king d6, and king d8, I actually just go h4, and again, you can't actually improve from here, and my pawn is actually just queening. So it's remarkable that when the king comes to d4, I can go rook a8, and I'm actually threatening a rook trade. And just to show you the other piece of that line, if you go c7, I can just go back to c8, and the king is not close enough to protect the pawn. And if I collect this pawn, I'm the one that's in the driver's seat, having a 3 versus 1. So not a losing position, not close to losing, but it does require some precision. And I played the move rook a4 check, which is not very precise, because now white can play the move c4 and has basically gotten an extra tempo on the position with a pawn a little bit further advanced. I now played the move rook a8, and again, my idea was now this rook can't get behind the c pawn, so I thought, oh, this is good for me. But I had not truly understood that there's no way I can win this game, because there's no way I can lose this game, because if I realized that there was no way I could lose this game, I would have started trying to play for a win, and I didn't really do that soon enough. After rook a8, white now played the move king c3, and here I think, I recognized that actually rook e8, with rook e8 I can actually trade the rook. So I caught on here, but I caught on a move too late. And white now played the move king c3 to give the rook a square to go to in the event of rook e8. The issue with king c3, though, is that the king is now further away from the queening square than it was a move ago, and this actually gives me precious time to do something else. But again, I did not recognize that I can actually try to play for a win here, and was still trying to just draw, and was very fearful that with my king cut off, that white could just swing around via b4 and go c6, king c5, and then start to queen the pawn. So the best move in this position is actually the move g5. I'm trying to make my own pass pawn, and this one would actually be really start to get me in the driver's seat. But instead, I played the move rook e8. And the idea here was I knew that the rooks can't be traded, because then I could get my king and blockade the c-pawn. And so I thought now, after the rook comes to d4, I could nudge my king closer, and that would help me tremendously. So now rook d4 was played, and I played king e7, and I felt really good now, because I thought, okay, my king is closer to the pawn. At least I'm not losing anymore. And finally here I started to play for a win. White now played king b4, and I played the move rook d8, which I thought was a kind of funny move. I was challenging the rook on e8, and now I'm challenging it on d8 because it helps my king get closer to the fray. And after rook d8, white now has to play rook e4 check, and now I played king d7, and all of a sudden my king is actually really close to the c-pawns, and I don't really have to worry about them queening. White now played rook e1, and I played the move rook b8 check, but this is not super precise. Instead, the move h4 right away would have been much better. I'm just trying to get my pawns going, because white really can't trade the rooks. I mean, after rook d1 check, I can just step to the side, and white really can't advance with the king, because then I can throw in the check. So there's no reason for me to do it now. So I played rook b8 check, but it's not as precise. White played king c3, and now I played h4, finally getting in kind of a winning mentality and understanding that my pawns are actually kind of an asset. And all of a sudden, the 3 versus 1 is not very easy to contend with. All of a sudden, the position is totally changed, and I'm the one that's playing for the win. Amazing when you consider I was 2 pawns down. After h4, white played the move rook g1, but this move actually should lose. Instead, the best move is actually c6 check, and this move actually holds the game, because after king takes c6, there's rook e6 check, and then you actually manage to get one of these pawns, and ultimately then the position would just fizzle out. The king is too close to the remaining pawn for this to be anything close to a win. And of course, if rooks come off the board, king and h pawn versus king is just a draw. So this would just be a simple draw. I actually saw this line, and again was still kind of thinking, oh, this is probably a draw, but my opponent was now under serious pressure on the clock, and really just the momentum of the game had changed so dramatically with this h4 move, because there's no way my opponent was thinking that this wasn't going to be a relatively easy conversion about 20 moves ago. And all of a sudden, it's just totally turned the tables. So after h4, white played rook g1, which should lose because c6 was not played. But here I actually made a blunder and gave white an opportunity to draw again by playing the move h3. I thought this move would work. I don't know why, because I thought if I just advance my pawn to h2 and get the rook behind it, it should be winning. But here, white can actually just play rook takes g6, and after rook h8, bring the rook back, and this position is actually just a draw. I can corral the c pawns, but essentially, once white gets the f pawn, he can run the king back and get the h pawn, and basically I'm just not in time to do anything about it, and the position again would just be completely simplified. Instead, I think this calculation was kind of tough for him to make with just a few minutes left on his clock, and he made a losing move here, which with the move after h3 with the move rook h1. And unfortunately for white, once you go passive, you really are going to be passive forever. And this really does nothing to kind of stop the march of the pawns. And so the position now is just lost. And so I played rook h8, just getting my rook behind the pawn. And now after king d4, I can play the move king c6. And the point is that these pawns actually are going to drop. And the reason for that is because white actually runs out of tempos. If you play rook h2, I can just shuffle my rook on h7, and then you have to move back, and then I can push the pawn. And once the rook runs out of moves, the king will also run out of moves, and I can start to collect the c pawns. And note that if you play f5, I can just play g5. And so that's essentially the problem, is that you really can't make any constructive moves here, and that really hurts you. And so after king c6, white played rook h2, and now I just went rook h4, and you could just see that if the rook moves back, I'll just play h2, or rook takes f4, and you're just tied up. And so white went king e3, but now I collect one pawn, and after king e3, I collect another. And the other feature in the position, which is incredibly, really, really unfortunate for white, is that the king-pawn endgames are now lost because you're actually material down. And so you can't actually go, well, white played king g3, but you can't actually take this pawn because actually I'll have a 2 versus 1 and can just win the f4 pawn with opposition. So after king g3, I played rook h5, and then white played king g4. But let's say white took on h3. After this exchange, I can just go king d4, king g4, king e4, king g3, and then f5. And then the f pawn just drops. And that's just completely losing. Of course, if a move like f5 is played, I can just play g5. And then this is also just winning. So really unfortunate turn of events, because I was 2 pawns down, and then all of a sudden I'm 2 pawns up like 50 moves later. What a miracle. So anyways, after king g3, rook h5, white played king g4, and now I just have to move my king in. So I went king d4, king g3, king e3. And really the other problem that white has is whenever you move the rook from h2, I'll just play h2 myself, because again, I don't mind losing the h-pawn if the rooks come off the board. And so white is slowly just running out of moves. After king d4, white played the move king g4, and now I went f5 check. And then after king g3, I went rook h8. And now you can see that the king on g3 is actually paralyzed. It has no moves, and so the rook on h2 has to do something. And so white went rook h1, and now I went h2, taking advantage of the fact that the king-pawn endings are winning. White now went rook e1 check, which does force my king off for a second, and I went king d2, just attacking that rook, forcing it back to h1. And now I went king e2, and now rook e1 check is not a possibility, so the rook on h1 can't move, and the king has to move to g2. After king g2, I went rook h4, and now the last remaining plan is just to corral the f-pawn for the h-pawn and not to allow any funny stalemate ideas, and I think I do this quite well. After king g3, I gave a check on g4, and then after king h3, I went king e3, and now we transition to an endgame where I essentially have two connected passers for nothing. And it's just a simple conversion, but it does require a little bit of technique, and my opponent decided to make me prove that, although I didn't feel like I'd have any problems converting. I will show you there was one funny moment that did kind of happen, and does show you that you have to be a little bit careful, but it's not so difficult. So anyways, after rook a2, I played rook b4, trying to force the king back horizontally. Rook a3 defended, and then I played king h5, rook c5, and then rook h4 check. Then I decided to go for this. And the point is that after king g3, I can just go f4 check, and you can't stay on the third rank because of rook h3, so you have to go back. And then I came in, advanced my pawns, and then went back again, threatened the check horizontally, and then went for the same maneuver again, playing for rook h3 and then pushing the f-pawn. So then check, threatening rook h2, and then pushing the f-pawn. And then here I have to be a little bit careful, because if I go king g3 right away, there's rook g2 check trying to get the stalemate trick. So I played king f4 just to kind of avoid that stalemating trick. Again, this would be a very unfortunate way to end the game. I mean, frankly, even here, the position is won. I can just go king f4, but I just decided to do it right away and not allow that. So after king f4, rook a2, and now rook h8, and then king g3, and then swinging my rook around with rook b8, threatening mate and 1. And now this funky check happened, but I can just step back to f4, the rook comes back, and then g4. Rook a8 check, and then king g3. It begs the question: well, what if the rook stayed on this rank and did not challenge you, because you can't go to king g3 because rook g3 check? Well, the point is I'd play g3, threaten this mate, and then actually walk my king to h3. And there's a really nice trick. Like if you shuffle here, well, you have to guard the mate now with rook c1. But now I can play king g4, let's say shuffle, oop, not there, and then shuffle, and then essentially there's a really nice trick like this with rook e1 check. And the point is that after you take, there's a fork, and then the king moves, and then you can take and actually queen your pawn with the winning king pawn ending. So that's another trick you can use, is sometimes you can check on the back rank, give up one of your pawns, but get your king in the proper position to win the game. I was aware of this, but rook a4 check just made my job easier, because now the king is already on the third rank and there's no stalemating idea. So after rook a1 is now forced because you can't go to a2 because of the back rank mate. And now this is actually simple, because now I can just bring my rook to the second rank. Although again, rook e8 here even works because of this rook e1 trick again in f2, and then taking the winning king pawn ending. But instead I decided to play rook b2, and after rook c1 I gave a check on g2, rook h1, and then rook h2 check. And here my opponent, after 98 moves, resigned. And the point is that if you play king g1, that would be 99, f2, and king f1, rook h1 check on move 100 would just pick off the rook. So yeah, after rook h2 check, I won this marathon of a game, and a game I really had no business winning, but I was quite proud to pull it out, just from a a fighting standpoint, I had a really, really dangerous position that was lost, but I defended really tenaciously and then finally took my chances when they came. And yeah, these types of wins can build character because you really shouldn't have won them, but you fight and you fight and you fight. And it wasn't a surprise that this game was actually easily the longest game of the round. Yeah. Anyways, after this win, I was now in 2.5 out of 3, and I was still in really good position with 2 rounds to go in this weekend event. So, yeah, I was really pleased with myself. Anyways, that's it for this one. Thanks for watching. Please like and or subscribe to the channel. And if you want to support the Road to Grandmaster journey, you could do so by making a donation through the PayPal link in the description below. Thanks again. Take care.